Hello and welcome to our next session for Aspire 2020. We're so glad that you're joining us today to learn more about emotional resiliency, another key component to building and developing and living with resiliency. So I'm so happy to welcome today Emily Prasader here with us. Emily is a licensed clinical social worker and a program facilitator with B2I. She was with us in Romania last year, and she has a lot to teach us today. I know I've already seen some of it, and I'm very excited for you guys to learn as well, because we learned about what resiliency is earlier this week and the importance of growth mindset from Ziggy earlier as well. And now we're going to touch more on emotions, which are so key because if we are not able to recognize our emotions and if we ignore them, we often end up doing things that we later regret. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Emily.
Thank you so much, Brianna, and hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be with you all today. Like Brianna said, I am a licensed clinical social worker. I work in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm particularly specializing in grief and trauma therapy, so I'm a psychotherapist in those particular areas. And I work for an agency called the Wentz Center for Loss and Healing. I'll give a brief caveat here. I'm not here as a representative of the Wentz Center for Loss and Healing, but I do have a lot of knowledge that I've gained from working there. And they're a fantastic organization if you're in the DC area and want to work with a group who is focused solely on grief and trauma. So I'm here today to talk about emotional resilience. And I want to start out by inviting everyone, including myself, to notice when we find the tendency to go into intellectualizing or overthinking, right? We're going to talk a lot about emotions, some of which are uncomfortable and might bring up some uncomfortable feelings even as you're watching this. And so I encourage you to, for sure, tend to yourself, take care of yourself, whatever you need to stay grounded and present, and challenge yourself not to see this necessarily as a training or a presentation, even though I do have slides. These are just for a visual aid. I want to encourage all of us to lean into some of maybe the sensations or emotions that come up. And I'll demonstrate a little bit more of what I mean in a minute with Brianna as my amazing, helpful participant to demonstrate that. But let's dive in. So where are we headed today? First off, we're going to talk about what I mean when I say the words emotional resilience, right? What is emotional resilience? How do I define that? And earlier in the week, you heard a lot about kind of resilience overall and what that means and what that looks like and what the research shows about it. I'm going to come at it from a more therapeutic perspective, from my perspective through the lens of, some grief and trauma and those types of things. So I'm going to share with you maybe a slightly different but not contradictory framework to understanding specifically emotional resilience. Then we're going to go into the why. Why does this work? Why is it important? Some of the brain science. I'm a little bit of a nerd, and so I'm going to share with you some of the brain science behind how this works and why it is that emotional resilience happens for us in terms of the brain science piece, as well as a little bit about mindfulness and some of the theories that are out there around this. The last part, and potentially the most important part, is the how. What are the next steps? How do we put this into practice? What can we do to start building our emotional resilience? And so that's where we're going to land today, with hopefully some really practical questions you can ask yourself, as well as a few suggestions for some ways to engage your body in taking care of your body and building up that capacity for emotional resilience. So we're going to start out with a little bit of participation as we're thinking about what emotional resilience is. So I want you to think to yourself, and if you're tuning into the live stream, feel free to put this in the comments. I'll be able to see them and read them out. But my first question for you is, what are examples of bad feelings? So maybe you think about, what feelings you were taught were not okay growing up, or you think about what feelings you tend to think of as annoying or frustrating, or you wish you didn't have those feelings. So think for yourself, what are some examples of those bad feelings? Ones that come to mind for me are anger. I was taught a lot of times growing up that anger was not acceptable, right? I couldn't express anger. It was dangerous, or it wasn't polite or ladylike or any of those things, right? I'm seeing here someone commenting anger, frustration, annoyance, right? These are the feelings that often we try to get rid of. Absolutely. Another one might be shame. I know any of you who are Brene Brown fans know that she talks a lot about shame and how that's an emotion and experience that we often avoid and we don't want to go into that place, right? Others might be rage, right? The even more intense end of the spectrum of anger, maybe even sadness. Maybe some of us are uncomfortable with grief and sadness. I know one for me that's really uncomfortable that I think of as a bad feeling because I just hate being in this place is regret, right? When we do something that we regret or we wish that we hadn't done, that can bring up a lot of frustration in us. I'm seeing here disappointment, absolutely. Feeling disappointed when you get let down or something happens that disappoints you, that can absolutely be a feeling that we don't want to spend much time in. And Heidi early in the week brought up the fact that we do get some choice of how long we spend in those feelings, right? How much time we spend in those feelings. However, I think there is some value to spending a little bit of time in the feelings that we typically try to avoid because often those feelings are trying to tell us something. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. So how about on the other end of the spectrum? What are some examples of good feelings? Feel free to write those in the comments if you'd like. I'll give a few examples. I know we're in this society and kind of Western society and capitalist society, we're taught that, excitement or kind of a drive to achieve and do things. So motivation sometimes are things that we see as good feelings because they're productive, right? A lot of times things like joy, I see that in the chat here, joy and gratitude are seen as good feelings. They're the ones we're supposed to strive for. They're the ones that don't hurt people, right? A lot of times when we're practicing joy and gratitude, we don't get into conflict with other people. So a lot of times we put some pressure on ourselves that we have to be in those feeling states, because those are the ones that are acceptable in society. Those are the ones we've been taught are good feelings. Optimism, eagerness, absolutely. Those are other ones that are really, valued in our society because of how productive they are, right? So I really want to encourage everyone that's tuning in to think about how can we reframe this idea of good and bad feelings into maybe a slightly different lens. There are certainly some feelings that are positive or negative, right? They may have very positive outcomes, negative outcomes. And Heidi talked about, how do we lean into the ones that bring about more positivity and decide how much we want to tap into the ones that maybe bring negativity, right? How much do we want to lean into those? And there are some of these feelings such as shame, such as anxiety, such as grief or sadness, right? That come up and they serve a purpose. And I know I'm a little bit biased because I am a grief therapist and I believe that there is value in some of those emotions as you're moving through a grief process, which, slight side note, is not just when someone has died. We can grieve lots of different things, including just the sense of normalcy in our world as a result of COVID-19 right now. So things like grief and sadness and anxiety, maybe guilt, are very uncomfortable feelings, and they do sometimes serve a purpose. Right? So the idea is not to see them as bad and something we need to get rid of, but as uncomfortable. And maybe we need to do something to cope with them or manage them or ride the waves of that emotion, right? Maybe it's an emotion that's moving through us and we just need to ride that wave as it passes. It's often a mindfulness technique to kind of envision some of your emotions and thoughts, but some of your emotions as floating on clouds, right? They come and go. No feeling lasts forever. They're going to pass through. Some of them have really important messages to tell us. And then also there are comfortable feelings, right? Some feelings that we may want to increase our experience of. And there's ways to do that. However, when we just think that our entire existence is going to be in the comfortable feelings, we often set ourselves up for more disappointment, more frustration, more annoyance at ourselves. We get stuck in this place of having feelings about our feelings, which can actually compound the suffering that those feelings already were bringing to begin with. I do want to make one note here, however. It's important to distinguish between uncomfortable feelings and then suffering, right? There are certainly levels of emotional distress where you might need extra support, right? You might need to see a therapist. You might need to seek support from your, social network. You might need to do something to tend to those feelings in a deeper way, not just allow them to pass through, right? So I'm not saying that every feeling is something you can just breathe through and it'll pass it on through. That's not necessarily the case. I like to think about the analogy of working out or playing a sport in this context, right? All of us who have played a sport or have trained for a marathon or triathlon or something like that, we know that there are times in that process when you're training or you're practicing that you're going to feel uncomfortable, right? Part of the process of getting better at your sport and growing your muscles and improving your time or your pace is actually pushing yourself to a point of discomfort. We actually don't grow if we don't push ourselves to a point of discomfort. However, if we're starting to feel like we're injuring ourselves or there's a suffering or it's prolonged, right? That's where we need to notice and maybe take a little more care of ourselves and tune into that. So think about feelings in the same way, right? There are some feelings that are uncomfortable and they're stretching us, they're pushing us to grow, and they're actually pushing us to grow our resilience. And I'm going to explain a little bit more of what that looks like through this idea of the window of tolerance. So this is a very common thing to talk about in like the therapist world, but I think it's something everyone needs to know about. So I'm going to come at it through a lot of my trauma lens because I do a lot of trauma work, but it's true for all of us. So all of us exist within this idea of a window of tolerance. So the upper limit and the lower limit to what we feel like is a tolerable emotion, right? So up at the top and way down at the bottom, even within those two limits, it might get to that place of discomfort. It might feel uncomfortable, but it's still within our window of tolerance. We're able to ride the waves, right? All of us exist on this wave. None of us are a flat line in that kind of neutral place. We have days where we're feeling maybe particularly anxious, which is kind of that upper level, or we may have days where we're feeling particularly sad, which is that lower level, right? The question comes is, when are we dipping outside of that window of tolerance? That's where I'm talking about this idea of suffering and where it goes beyond just discomfort. So I'm going to talk about each ends of that spectrum and then how this relates to emotional resilience. So on the top end, you've got what we call hyper arousal. So as you can see, the movement within those two lines, within the two limits of our window of tolerance, pops up into a heightened state. And this is when the energy is at a heightened level. So it's things like feeling anxious, feeling like your adrenaline's pumping, anything that's like an active state. And in a trauma perspective, in terms of how we respond to threats in our environment, there's two ways that our brain will respond when we're in this state. Only two. So it's fight or flight. And you've probably heard of this before, the fight or flight response. But what this can look like on an emotional or an interpersonal level is you might be extremely irritable. You might snap at your kids. You might feel like you aren't able to regulate those emotions and you get really angry and have an outburst. It might look like violence, right? On the flight end of things, it might look like, avoidance, right? Not wanting to talk to people, isolating yourself, getting away from what the trigger is that has sent you into this place of hyperarousal. And the thing is once we're past that line at the upper limit of our window of tolerance, we actually no longer are fully in control at all. It's our primitive survival brain that is in charge and is causing us to go into this fight or flight response. We don't choose which response we do, we just act. And as Brianna mentioned at the beginning, sometimes when we're suppressing our feelings and not tuning into our feelings, we end up in this place of hyperarousal before we realize it. So I'm going to talk in a minute about, how do we bend that curve? How do we notice as it's starting to move up? But that's one of the ways we might get kicked out of this place of our window of tolerance, and that place where we feel like we can bounce back from some of the emotional triggers throughout our day. On the other end of the spectrum is when we get dipped down into a lower energy place, and this is called hypo arousal. So it's when our arousal states goes lower. And this is the part that not a lot of people always hear about because it's a different part of our nervous system that gets activated in this case. But it is also that primitive brain trying to keep us alive in the face of a threat or a trigger. So the options here, when our brain gets kicked down into hypoarousal, the first one is freeze. So this might look like shutting down. This might look like numbing behaviors, whether that's using alcohol, using drugs, using other addictions, other sources to be able to numb some of these feelings. We might even find that sometimes as we start to move up into hyperarousal, we engage in less than healthy coping mechanisms that actually bring us back down, but bring us so far down into this place of hypoarousal. The second one that our brain might choose in this moment is called the appease response or the fawn response. So the freeze or appease response is how I usually talk about it. And this looks like some of our tendencies to be perfectionistic, to be a people pleaser, to try and smooth everything over before conflict happens, right? So sometimes our brains think that the best way to deal with this trigger or what my brain is perceiving as a threat is to just make sure everyone around me is okay. So you might be resonating with that if you're the kind of person who goes straight into helping others when you're feeling stressed, right? So all of these are emotional states that might make us feel out of control, right? We may not feel grounded. We may not feel present in the moment. We may not feel in control of our emotional states. And so emotional resilience at its core is exploring how can we bend that curve a little bit of our emotional states as we move throughout the day? How are we bending that curve, noticing when we're starting to get escalated or starting to shut down, and do something to tend to our body, right? Not to ignore the feeling, not to suppress it, but to do something to tend and nurture to our body. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. And then the other end of this, emotional resilience is also sometimes expanding that window of tolerance, as you see here on the slide, right? So when we tap into those uncomfortable feelings, so not getting kicked all the way up into hyperarousal, not going all the way down into hypoarousal, but when we lean into some of those uncomfortable feelings and we get to kind of the upper limits of our window of tolerance, it actually stretches our window of tolerance. So this is why we develop emotional resiliency when we go through hardships. When it's a hardship that we feel like we're able to survive, right? It doesn't tap into our threat responses. We don't feel completely out of control. But when it is a hardship that we feel like very, very uncomfortable and stressed and overwhelmed at times, but we're still within our window of tolerance, it actually pushes those edges of our window of tolerance, especially if we can explore that discomfort and then come back to a place of safety. So it's about that ebb and flow of leaning into the discomfort and then being able to pull back. So it might look like, okay, I'm going to spend 30 minutes journaling about my feelings right now, about the grief I'm feeling around all the losses that I've experienced with COVID-19, whether that's death related or not. I'm going to spend 30 minutes. I'm going to set a timer. And then as soon as that timer goes off, I'm going to go outside and I'm going to go for a walk with my dog because I know that will help me feel safe, bring me some joy, and help get me back to the middle ground of that window of tolerance. So that's how I define emotional resiliency. Is it's absolutely the ability to bounce back. That's what we most often hear when people talk about resiliency. But through my lens and in my experience with my clients, as well as my own personal life and with friends, building emotional resiliency really looks like tuning in to the ebb and flow throughout our day and finding ways to flatten that curve a little bit, not completely, but flatten it a little bit, and then expanding that window of tolerance so that when those hardships come, we have a little more space to be able to lean into the discomfort. So I hope that that's a helpful concept. I see that many of you are hearing like, oh my gosh, this is the first time that I've ever heard about the hypoarousal. So much of this is often new, and I love explaining it to people because it gets taught to folks like me who go through school to be a therapist, but it's so helpful for all of us just to think about our daily lives through this lens, because then when we're moving up that curve, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to fix it right away. We just have to notice it and find ways to tend to ourselves and bring that back down to a safe place. All right, so I'm going to pause here and show a quick video that is going to explain how this all works in the brain. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this and bring up the video really quick, but I want you all to follow along with this video in a very specific way. So the video is going to show you a hand model of the brain. So as you're watching it, go ahead and have your hand up, and it really looks like this. You have your thumb tucked in and your 4 fingers folded over. And a little hint that helps remember those 4 threat responses I was talking about: fight, flight, freeze, and appease. Kind of a handy trick there with the 4 fingers. But I'm going to show this video, and I love his accent in this video, and y'all probably need a break from my voice. So I'm going to show this video, and he's going to explain the different parts of our brain. And there's really 3 main parts that are important here for understanding how we build emotional resiliency from a brain science perspective. So I'm going to pull this video up and just tune in. It's a couple minutes. And try to follow along with your hand, because that's a really handy way to be able to remember it, maybe explain it to your children or your colleagues or friends that may be interested in this. So here we go.
Wrist, the forearm coming up to here, is like your spinal cord. And right here at the end of the wrist is like the base of your skull. And here, at the bottom of your palm, this is like the reptile brain, the life support system of the brain. So, you know, if the rest of your brain is wiped out through, say, for example, a stroke or a car accident, this life support part of your brain, the reptile brain, can still keep your body alive, can still keep all your organs functioning and your breath and your heart and so forth. And this is where a lot of autonomic nervous system operates and stems from, this reptile brain. Now, above the reptile brain is the mammalian brain, often called the limbic brain or the emotional brain. So reptiles, they've got the fight or flight response, or they've got the freeze, shut down, flop and drop response, but they don't really have anything that is even remotely close to the complex emotional states that we see in mammals. And the limbic brain has many different parts to it, but two in particular that we'll be looking at in this course are the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, don't worry about memorizing those terms for now. We will revisit them later. But this kind of is the middle brain, the limbic brain, the mammalian brain, basically responsible for emotions. Now, on top of the limbic mammalian emotional brain, you've got the cerebral cortex, the thinking cap of the brain. This cerebral cortex is much thicker in mammals, but especially so in primates, and particularly so in human beings, more so than any other primate. And this cerebral cortex, the thinking part of the brain responsible for consciousness and cognition. And right at the front of the cerebral cortex, you have the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right up here at the front of your forehead, above your eyes. And particularly important to us is the medial prefrontal cortex, this bit in the middle, right at the front, this bit up here. This plays a very important role in mindfulness and awareness. So let's just go through it again. You've got your spinal cord, you've got your reptile brain. Underneath your cerebral cortex, you've got your mammalian brain with the amygdala, the hippocampus, responsible for emotions. And then you've got your cerebral cortex, your thinking cap of the brain on top, and the medial prefrontal cortex right here in the center at the front, right there.
Just 1 minute, folks, to pull my slides up again. But I want you to think about, what you noticed in that video. What was new to you? What was maybe interesting information? It's really helpful for me when I'm explaining, how all of this works to folks, that they understand there are actual 3 parts of my brain that are operating right now that are playing a role in my emotional resilience. So I'm going to explain how what he just described about the 3 parts of our brain really relate to emotional resilience specifically. And I renamed them slightly. He gave the scientific definitions of the brain, but sometimes it's helpful for me just to remember them as the thinking part of our brain, the feeling part of our brain, and the surviving part of our brain. Right? So that front part of our brain is the prefrontal cortex that he named. It's the part that is mostly in humans. It's in some mammals, but it's mostly in humans. And that's the part that is able to think through decisions, right? Think about consequences. Say, how do I want to respond to this situation, right? That's the part that's going on whenever we're operating, especially within our window of tolerance. That part is absolutely online and active and fully operational. The feeling part of our brain is that middle part of our brain. And he mentioned the amygdala, which that is the part of our brain that senses threats. Okay, so the amygdala, I'm going to come back to that in a minute because it's important for understanding why mindfulness is so helpful in terms of the research. But the feeling part of our brain is where the signals from our outside world come in. So the brain is processing everything that's happening around us through that middle part of our brain, the feeling part of our brain. It's where our emotions live. And that is the part of our brain that basically makes the decision, are we going to kick our responses up into the thinking brain at the top, the front part of our brain, or are we going to kick our responses down into survival mode, into that hyperarousal or hypoarousal states? And so a lot of what emotional resilience building skills are doing is actually strengthening the pathways between our feeling brain and the part that takes in all the inputs and our thinking brain. And things that help with strengthening that pathway is actually practicing things like mindfulness. He mentioned that mindfulness lives in that front part, the medial prefrontal cortex. And when we practice mindfulness, especially when we practice it in a regulated state, when we're in that window of tolerance, it's what allows the bonds between our feeling brain and the thinking brain to grow stronger. So our brain becomes more likely to go into thinking mode rather than just reacting and surviving mode in response to any stimuli, including emotionally distressing situations or triggers, right? Here's the thing though, if your brain perceives something as a threat to your safety, you are always going to go down into survival mode. And that's a good thing, right? So our goal of strengthening the pathway between the feeling brain and the thinking brain doesn't mean that there's not also value in the pathway that goes down into survival, right? That's the part of our brain that has kept our ancestors alive forever, right? That's the part of our brain that would get us away from a bear in a forest if we needed to. So that part is very good. However, in this world that we live in, especially in this post-COVID world where there are a lot of stressors around us, sometimes the pathway between our feeling brain and our thinking brain gets a little bit damaged, and our brain leans more towards going down that lower road into the survival brain because of how much is coming in. And so when we feel ourselves getting overwhelmed by the incoming stimuli, that's when it's important to engage in some of those ways of nurturing ourselves and tuning into the feelings that are happening so that we can notice them and engage in some of these more mindful practices that help build our emotional resilience. So that's part of the why of why all this works. And I mentioned in that mindfulness, and I know you all are going to be talking about mindfulness even more next week and going through some mindfulness exercises. And I'm not going to lead you through a specific mindfulness exercise, but I do want to touch on how it relates to all of this, how it relates to emotional resilience. So what is all this about mindfulness? So the really cool thing about mindfulness is that they've done studies that show when you practice mindfulness, so you do some guided meditation, mindful meditation with a group or with a therapist, even just for 8 weeks. So practicing once a week for 8 weeks, and then practicing some on your own as well, but practicing in the group or one-on-one with your therapist for 8 weeks, and then applying it outside of that space. When you do that for 8 weeks, there are measurable differences in the size of your amygdala, which is that part of the brain that senses threats. Right? So when we practice mindfulness, when we stretch our ability to be in the present moment and stay grounded and stay safe, it actually grows our ability to sense what's going on in our environment and respond with that thinking brain, right? The amygdala becomes less hyperactive. I often think about the amygdala as like a smoke alarm. So all of us have had a smoke alarm in our house before that would go off every time we boiled water, right? That's not the job of a smoke alarm. The smoke alarm has a very important role, and it should go off when there is a fire that is a threat to us, just like our brain should kick us down into survival mode. But when the amygdala is hyperactive because of a stressful environment or maybe past trauma and triggers that come up, it often kicks us down into that survival mode more than is helpful for us, and it becomes maladaptive. And so when we're practicing mindfulness, we're actually allowing that amygdala to calm down, right? We're rewiring that amygdala just like we would a smoke alarm that's oversensitive so that it can go off at the right times, at the times when it would be helpful for our survival, not maladaptive. So that's some of the science behind why the mindfulness piece works. And so just a shameless plug here to make sure you tune into the mindfulness session that's coming up next week and practice some of this, right? And test it out. Some of us, I know when I first started practicing mindfulness, was very skeptical, and I was a little bit nervous of what might bubble up when I did start to tune in. And that's valid, right? All of us have things that we have pushed down for a long time, and mindfulness can bring all of that up. So dip your toe in slowly, but I encourage you to do that with an open mind and give it some time, see how it might be helpful. The last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of the why does emotion, what's the why behind emotional resilience, is really leaning into this theory in the therapy world called internal family systems. And I'm just going to talk briefly about it. And a caveat, I'm not fully trained in practicing this modality of therapy. I've had some training in it, enough to kind of understand the concepts. But if you are curious about this, I encourage you to do more reading. I'll give you a link that will be posted later when this goes up on the Facebook. I'll give you a link to do some more reading, as well as if you're looking for a therapist, it might be worth exploring someone who's trained in this specific model. But I'm going to introduce it by reading this quote from the founder of this theory of internal family systems. So his name is Richard Schwartz, and he says, if you consider your thoughts, emotions, urges, and impulses to be coming from an inner landscape that's best understood as a kind of internal family, so this idea that inside of us there are different parts that operate similar to how a family would, and this internal family is populated by subpersonalities. I'm not talking about having multiple personalities, but each part of you has different pieces that it brings to the table, right? There's different parts of us that show up in different contexts. And many of those parts are childlike and maybe even suffering. Then, through that lens, it makes more sense to take that next step of comforting and holding these inner selves rather than just observing and objectifying them. So you might have just lost me there. You might be like, whoa, Emily, what are you talking about? Break this down. So what this means is we're building beyond just mindfulness. awareness, right? So mindfulness is the first step and a half, I would say. Mindfulness is the first step where we're noticing, we're tuning in, and we're seeing those emotions that are coming up, right? Mindfulness isn't just about completely clearing your mind or not feeling emotions. It's about tuning in and noticing and being present with those emotions. Some of that leaning into the discomfort I was talking about. After that, it is so important to notice those parts of ourselves and maybe give them a name and understand what those parts are doing. I said earlier that our emotions sometimes are trying to tell us something, right? Or our emotions are playing a very important role. It's important to get curious, right? When the anxiety bubbles up, I wonder what this anxiety is trying to tell me. I wonder what my anxiety is doing for me, right? Rather than saying, oh, there comes the anxiety, I need to make it stop. What is this doing for me? So noticing it, naming it, and then responding from a place of wanting to comfort that part of ourselves, right? Often those parts of ourselves, they might have roots in our childhood. They might have roots in hardship. They might have roots in wounds or trauma or grief, right? They have roots in some of these things that we've been through, and they've come up because they are serving a role in keeping us safe and taking care of us and making us successful in our life. And so many times those parts of ourselves, those emotions at times, sometimes the parts are an emotion, right? Sometimes those emotions come up and they're working really hard to keep us alive, keep us safe, keep us moving forward, right? And so if we can have some curiosity and then some compassion towards those emotions, towards those parts of ourselves, it actually holds some space for bending that curve within the window of tolerance, right? We can comfort ourselves when those emotions are starting to rise. And I'll share a link, like I said, for an article written by Richard Schwartz where this quote came from. But the theory is internal family systems. It's fascinating read. If you're curious about it, look up anything he's written as anything about the topic. It's really interesting to start framing your entire experience throughout your day, throughout your life as, I wonder what part of me is showing up right now. And so I think what will be most helpful to drive this home is I'm going to actually do a demonstration, and I want to give credit where credit's due. These questions I'm about to go through with my lovely assistant, Brianna, are from a therapist named Catherine Hatch, and she has a private practice in Oregon. So if any of you are in Oregon, check her out. It's groundedgrief.com. We'll share that in the later post as well. But I want to go through some questions with Brianna, and I've prepared Brianna for this, so she's not going to be caught off guard by any of the questions I ask. She's been prepared for this. And as I'm doing this, I encourage you all to just notice what's coming up for Brianna. So if you want to answer the questions for yourself, that's fine. But I am going to let you know that this can bring up some intense emotions. So make sure that you're in a place where you feel safe, where you feel like you can take care of yourself and whatever it means if you are following along. But I will also welcome you if you don't feel comfortable following along. Just notice what I'm asking of Brianna. And then I'm going to share some of these questions in the next slide to wrap up, to make sure you have some of these to be able to ask yourself throughout the day. All right. So Brianna, are you ready?
I did say I would mentally prepare to tap into my emotions, so I'm ready.
Absolutely. We're going to be challenging Brianna to tune in and just notice, not try to fix, not try to overthink it, but just to tune in. Okay. So Brianna, the first thing I'm going to have you do is I'm going to put I want you to put both of your feet on the ground. Make sure they're firmly rooted. This helps our body know that we're on the ground. We're not floating away. One of our body's responses in that hypo arousal place can sometimes be to dissociate, where we actually feel like we leave our body and check out a little bit. And I don't want you going there. I want you to be present. Okay. So feet on the ground, comfortable seat. Notice kind of the support of the chair beneath you. If it has a back, make sure it feels supportive against your back. And then I want you to take a few deep breaths with me. You can close your eyes, but you don't have to. It is totally up to you. We're just going to take a few deep breaths, and I invite all of you tuning in to take them with me as well. We've been talking about some pretty hard emotions. So here we go. Take a slow breath in through your nose, and then a nice relaxed exhale through your mouth. One more, in through the nose, out through the mouth. And keep breathing in just a comfortable pace. Just let your breath flow in and out with ease. You don't have to control it in any way. Just let it flow in and out. And now I want you to do a little bit of a body scan. So as you're letting your breath flow naturally, I want you to start with the tippy top of your head and just slowly work your way through the whole body, just taking stock. There's a little bit of heat here. There's a little bit of tension there. Maybe there's a tingling. Just notice. your whole body. Notice what's coming up all the way down to the tip of your toes. Just a full body scan. And I want you to see if there's any sensations coming up. I mentioned a few of those. A tingling. Maybe you've got an itch on your nose. Feel free to scratch it. You're welcome to if you need to. Maybe there's a tension somewhere. Maybe there's a sensation in your stomach, like butterflies or a rumbling. Maybe you're hungry. Notice your heartbeat. Is it slow or fast? Strong or kind of subtle? So now that we've tuned into the sensations, I want you to notice emotions. See if there's any emotions coming up. Not thoughts, not things going through your head, but emotions. What's bubbling up as you're letting yourself be still? Just notice them. We're not going to try and fix them. We don't have to analyze them. We're just noticing. And then the last thing I'll have you do is see if there's any images crossing across your mind. Not thoughts, but just images or colors or shapes. There might be, there might not. Just see what's there. I'm going to give you a few seconds to finish tuning in and just noticing. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes, and I just have a few questions that we're going to go through. Okay. So as you were scanning, was there a particular part of you, whether it was a sensation, emotion, or image, any of the above, that felt like it was crying out for the most attention, or maybe it was the loudest part, or that you noticed it the most or first?
Tension, because I was feeling tension in many parts of my body.
Okay, so you were feeling tension in many parts. What's the part where you felt it the strongest? What part of your body did you feel the strongest in?
Like upper back between my shoulder blades.
Okay, so right there between the shoulder blades, absolutely. Many of us are feeling that right now with working from home and not always having the best setup and seat to sit in, hunching over computers. I feel that. So when you noticed that part of you, that tension, was there a particular emotion that bubbled up with it, that was related to it or tied to it?
Anxiety.
Okay, so the tension's connected to some anxiety. Does that tension and anxiety, if you were to visualize it, this part's a little tricky, but if you were to visualize that tension between your shoulder blades and that emotion of anxiety, does it have a shape or a color?
No color, but it's circular.
Okay, so the anxiety and the tension is like a circle. Can you show me like how big you would imagine the circle to be with your hands?
Yep, pretty big. Oh,
pretty big.
On the screen.
Pretty big. All right, so it's a pretty big circle. Is it a perfectly round circle? Is it more stretched like an oval?
I think it's pretty circular, but that may be just because I like a perfect circle.
Okay, all right. Might be tied to some of the anxiety. We'll get there. So tell me a little bit more about this circle. You said it doesn't have a color. Does it have like a border or any like texture or anything like that?
It's like black of the outline, and then maybe kind of like a neutral color, not see-through or transparent, but yeah, neutral.
Okay. Does this circle, this anxiety, this tension, this circle, all in one, does it have a name? Could you give it a name right now? What's the first thing that pops into your mind?
Tense.
Okay, so tense. So for the rest of the time, I'm going to use the name tense as if it is an actual like thing that we're talking about. All right, so that is its name. I know it's a little weird. Just roll with me. So how long has tense been around? Does it feel familiar? Does it feel like it's been around a long time? Is it new? Tell me how long tense has been around.
It's very familiar, but heightened right now.
Okay. So tense has been around for a very long time, maybe as long as you can remember. Yep. Yeah. Okay. All right. So it's been around as long as you can remember, and it's heightened right now. So maybe the circle is even bigger right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What job do you think it's doing? What's its role?
I think it gives me a sense of control.
So tense gives you a sense of control. So maybe that also means that the anxiety that you feel at times is related to a desire for control.
That wouldn't surprise me. I do love control.
Absolutely. So I'll just briefly explain for a minute here before we do the last couple questions. Many times when we notice these parts of ourselves and they're crying out for attention, the way Brianna's tension is crying out for attention, they've been working hard for a very long time. So Brianna named that it's been around as long as she can remember. It's working in overdrive right now. Many times these parts of ourselves have been working really hard and they might be really tired. And yet they have to keep doing their job because they think they're protecting us in some way, right? Your anxiety is protecting you from feeling out of control. Your anxiety is protecting you from feeling a lack of control, right? So this part is doing a really important job and it might need a break, right? So it can be both and. I can see a little bit of discomfort with giving it a break. But yeah, these parts are doing a really, really important job, but they might sometimes need a break, as scary as that is. And it might be that part just now in that face you made was like, no, I got an important role. Don't make me take a day off, right? And so I want you to practice now, Brianna, imagining that circle. So imagine it's like in front of you. So it moved from your back to in front of you. You're looking at it and kind of having a conversation with it. I want you to just say, I see you tense.
I see you tense.
You're working really hard.
You're working really hard.
You're working really hard to make sure I feel in control.
To make me feel in control.
Yeah. Maybe tense is tired. So I want you to tell me, as you were talking to tense, as weird as it felt, but as you were talking to that part of yourself, did anything shift or change as you acknowledged it, as you gave it compassion?
Just
Even
like
in the
releasing a breath, like a deep sigh.
Okay. So it's almost like the circle exhaled.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And as the circle exhaled, did it get a little bit smaller? Did it shift?
Yes.
Did it change?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Absolutely. What do you think this part needs from you right now?
Some self-compassion.
And maybe it needs a few more of those exhales.
Yeah, some deep breathing.
Yeah. So what we just did is not rocket science. It might have seemed a little weird, but any of us can do this with ourselves, right? You don't have to be guided through it with someone, but you can tune in to these parts of ourselves and get curious. So noticing first, and then getting curious about the role of these parts. So naming it in a way, which we did. We named it as tense, and we were able to understand, okay, it's serving a role. It's helping me feel in control. It's helping me not feel too anxious, right? And then we nurtured it just a little bit. We did something to notice it and say, you're doing a really good job. You're working really hard. Maybe you can exhale just a little bit. And I want you to tune in, Brianna. Did you notice anything shift in the way your shoulders feel or the space between your shoulder blades? Did anything shift?
Yeah, a little less tense.
Just a little. And sometimes it's these small shifts, right? Sometimes we go into these exercises and expect it to be gone by the time we get out of it, right? That's not always how it works. Sometimes it's just reminding our bodies that there's a possibility of something shifting even in the slightest. And so I have a few questions that I asked Brianna that I'm going to share with all of you that might be really helpful as you're going into, day to day of managing the stress of COVID, managing the stress of life, that maybe you can ask yourself. And I will say here a slight caveat. If you do an exercise like this and you start to notice that it's bringing up a lot of intense emotions, or you're starting to have memories or flashbacks that feel really intense, I strongly encourage you to seek out some professional support, whether that's a therapist or a social worker or, a counselor in some way, because they can really help you walk through this in a gentle way. You'll notice that with Brianna just now, I didn't, ask her to explore the moment that this part arrived or, the story behind why this part arrived, because that could dig up some pretty intense memories, right? We don't know. Sometimes we don't even know in ourselves when those might come up. And so if, as you're asking yourself these questions, these things start to bubble up, maybe be open to exploring getting some additional help, because we actually build emotional resilience even more when we do this in community, right? So whether it's with professional support like a therapist or just with people you trust and love, it's important to make sure we're doing this not in isolation. Okay. All right. So I'm going to bring up these last few questions so you all have them as a reference, because I think it's really helpful to be able to write these down or be able to, see these later on if you want to refer back to them. So I'll leave these up for a good bit. And I just encourage you to think about, how can I remind myself to ask some of these questions throughout my day, right? So the 3 steps I did with Brianna just there, we noticed, we did a scan, we tuned in. Sometimes that's the first step. Many times I get through my entire day and I don't realize my shoulders are up around my earlobes because I'm so tense, right? I haven't even noticed the tension that's going on. So maybe you can ask yourself, what do I notice right now about my inner world, about my body, about what's going on the inside? And then you can ask yourself, what emotions or sensations are coming up for me, right? And even tracking that throughout your day, noticing what times of day certain emotions start to come up, not so we can fix them, not so we can suppress them, but so we can tune in and then nurture them. And then once you've started to notice some of these sensations, some of the experiences, what part, which sensation, which feeling, which experience in my inner world seems like it needs the most attention? Which part's crying out for some support? Does this part have a shape, a color, a name? And maybe explore, like we did with Brianna, what role is it playing? Because it usually is serving a role. I like to think of emotions and feelings as like little messengers that are trying to tell me something. Sometimes they're very annoying messengers and I wish they would go away, but they're still trying to tell me something. And then finally, what does this part need from me right now? What do they need to hear? What does it need to hear from me? And how can I show this part of myself compassion? How can I nurture it? So let me get really concrete here. What do I mean by that when I say nurture it? So in the case of Brianna, right, the part of her that is feeling like it needs control, the part of her that is tense and is connected to anxiety, does that part just need to lay down flat on the ground for a minute, right? Sometimes it's a physical nurturing of the part of your body that's crying out, right? Sometimes it's just putting a hand on whatever part of you is feeling the pain or the discomfort, and just kind of some self-touch. I know it sounds strange, but sometimes just putting our own hand on the part that is hurting and imagining kind of sending compassion to that part can start to help nurture those parts. And then it's also some of the things that many of you know about, but it might be using them with intention. Things like making sure you're getting exercise, but tuning into your body and what it needs, right? Maybe today's not the day for a 4-mile run. Maybe it's a day for gentle stretching, right? That's nurturing our body, and that's nurturing our inner world as well. Maybe it's making sure I'm drinking water, right? Every time I grab a glass of water and take a sip, I see that as nurturing, right? Not, oh yeah, I need to make sure I'm hydrated. That's one of the things I'm trying to be better at, but reframing it as this is me nurturing my body. Maybe it's a hot shower, right? We're not talking about spending hours and hours of time in these self-care strategies. I believe in self-care. I think self-care is important, but sometimes it's much more simple than we've been taught. It's not always the hour massage. It's not always the going on vacation and spending money on things. Sometimes it's just the thoughts in our head, the way we talk to ourselves. So Brianna was able to talk to that part of herself and say, I see that you're working really hard. So it might look like, hello there, anxiety. I see that you're trying to get my attention. You're working really, really hard, right? And holding space, but doing it in small bites, right? We don't always have to spend all of our time in that discomfort, right? How do we also have an exit strategy? So I'm going to tune into this feeling. Like I said earlier, you can journal for 30 minutes. I'm going to tune into this feeling for a little bit, and then I'm going to do something fun. I'm going to watch a funny movie. I'm going to play with my kids. I'm going to, go to the dog park with my dog. That always gets me out of my funk. So finding ways to also have an exit plan to be able to dip back out and get a little bit more into that window of tolerance. So these are the 3 steps, and I see that that's been shared in the chat. So I encourage you to maybe just write down 1 or 2 of these that you're going to start asking yourself throughout your day, right? Maybe post it on a Post-it note somewhere so that you see it. What do I notice? Tune in. Maybe you set a timer on your phone. It's like every 3 or 4 hours, it's a tune in break, right? Not to do anything, but just notice. Like, hey, what are my legs like right now? Maybe just pick one part of your body. Are my legs trying to tell me something? Sometimes I notice that my leg is bouncing a whole lot, and that might be connected to something that my body needs. Maybe it needs to get up and move and discharge some of this energy. Maybe it needs to stretch. Maybe it needs to just take a deep breath because I've got a lot of pent up anxiety. So think about how you can incorporate this into every day, not as a huge lifestyle change, but just a slight shift in how you're tuning into yourself and your emotions. So the thing I'll leave you with is this question. And you can feel free to share it in the comments if you'd like. But I listed some practical ways of practicing compassion, right? Whether that's drinking water, taking a hot shower, shifting our thoughts, the way we talk to ourselves, the way we judge our own emotions. What does having compassion for those parts of you, yourself, look like? What does self-compassion look like for you? And maybe what does it look like for you this evening or tomorrow or later this week? What is one thing you can do to practice a little bit of self-compassion? I know for me, it's going to be letting myself know, telling myself that I did the best I can today, even if I didn't get everything done on my to-do list. Maybe that's what self-compassion looks like for you. But I encourage you to really think on this. What does it look like for you? And then how do you build that? How do you grow that and stretch that? Because at the end of the day, we can't grow our emotional resilience if we're judging our emotions. We have to have compassion for the parts of us that are showing up and might be distressing and might be overwhelming, and we might not like some of those emotions, but they're all serving a role. And it's important to have some curiosity and compassion with those parts. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Any of you who are in the comments, feel free to add any questions that you have there. I've also shared my email address here if you have any questions. I'm happy to share some resources, build on what we talked about today, anything like that. But I just strongly encourage all of you, after watching this, write down one thing you're going to do, or tell somebody else one thing you're going to do to practice that self-compassion. Because that, at the end of the day, is what is going to grow our emotional resilience. Thank you all.